title because that was a title by a book called, the name of the author was William, I guess you pronounce it Knoke, K-N-O-K-E. And he was the founder and president of what was called the Harvard Capital Group. And that was the sort of advisory group to global corporations, which I'm somewhat familiar with because I did a little of that myself back some years ago with another outfit that had offices in Tokyo and Frankfurt and Paris and London and New York. And what they wanted to do was they had country experts, and that's what I was. I was a sort of country expert primarily regarding Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. And they wanted to know who was rising to power and who was falling from power, short-term, 18 months, long-term, 5 years. And they had transnational corporations, governments, and intelligence agencies as their clients. And so this fellow was with a similar group, William Knoke, and his book was titled Bold New World, with a subtitle, The Essential Roadmap to the 21st Century. And he titled that because it was published in 1996. Now, what he did in there, similar to what I do, I try to project what's going to happen. Knoke projected that, quote, in the 21st century, we will each retain, talk about our nations, our indigenous cultures, our unique blend of tribal affiliations. Yet, he says, our passion for the large nation-state for which our ancestors fought with their blood will dwindle to the same emotional consequences of county or province today. A new spirit of global citizenship will evolve in its place, and with it, the ascendancy of global governance, end quote. So he's one of these insiders who's just, talking about what's going to come. The nation-state will sort of dwindle away, and we'll look at them like counties or provinces, because we'll all be these world citizens, and the world will have a global governance or world government, and that's what'll really matter. Now, I want to stress that this vision, this quote that I used, is not a new one, because my old pen pal, as I call him, Arnold Toynbee, who was probably the leading historian of the first part of the 20th century.
Hold that thought, Dennis. Hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and you must understand that there is a small group of people whose loyalty is not to America. They're a subversive group. They want to create a world government, a world financial system. They want to, of course, and they want to control a one world government, a one world financial system, a one world religion. They want to destroy Christianity. These are people of great wealth, and this is their main goal and purpose in life, and this has been going on at least for 100 years. And basically, these are the people who control both political parties, control the banking system, control our military, control most of our major corporations, control the media, control our churches, control our great tax-exempt foundations, control the intelligence agencies. They have their leaders in the leadership of both political parties. And basically, of course, they are energized by this demand that we are going to change the world. They're going to use the financial and military power of the United States to bring about this world government, which is why we have our troops stationed all throughout the world. This is why certainly we're concerned about what's going on in Ukraine, why we've overthrown the government certainly in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Libya and in Tunisia and certainly in Egypt, and we're trying to overthrow the government certainly in Syria today. We've killed 140,000 civilians over there. The people, nobody would be dead if we weren't financing the rebels, and it's all done with your tax money, and the American people really don't care. But what everybody's missing is the fact that God does care, and I fear He's going to bring terrible judgment on America, because the good people here are doing absolutely nothing other than enjoying life and think it's going to go on forever in one way or another. And I believe God is going to bring His judgment on America, and I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and His justice will not sleep forever. Go right ahead, Dennis.
Sounds like Jefferson. That's a good quote. The Arnold Toynbee was probably the leading world historian in the first part of the 20th century. And I was a young fellow in high school. One of my assignments was to become him, know all about him and so forth. And so after I did this really, thorough report and write-up, and it's very, very much in depth. I sent a copy over to him at Chatham House, and he wrote back a nice letter. Young fellow, couldn't have done better myself, that sort of stuff. So anyway, what I found out, I didn't know at the time, but later, when Dr. Stan had sent me the list of the Secret Society membership list, Toynbee was one of the members of the Association of Helpers. There's a circle of initiates, and then there's an Association of Helpers as part of this effort, on the Cecil Rhodes' effort to take as he said, the government of the whole world. And so I was looking back, and in June 1931, Toynbee had delivered a paper which sounds very much similar to what William Doakey just said in this 1996. And in that 1931 paper, Toynbee, who was part of Cecil Rhodes' effort, said a local state may lose its sovereignty without losing those familiar features which endear it to the local patriot. Such features, I mean, as the local vernacular language and folklore and costume, and the local monuments of the historical past. But if we are frank with ourselves, we shall admit that we are engaged on a deliberate and sustained and concentrated effort to impose limitations upon the sovereignty and the independence of the sovereign independent states.
And basically, of course, this is a subversive movement. The people who control our government are subversive. Why? They want to subvert our form of government. We are changing from being a republic into a democracy, and a democracy is nothing more than ruled by a ruling elite that control both political parties, and they bribe the politicians to vote for whatever they want, and basically it's always centralizing ever more power in the government, and now they're watching everything you do. They're reading your emails, they're reading your faxes, but does anybody really care as long as things are good and we have football and basketball and baseball and all sorts of entertainment and wonderful television, free television entertainment night after night after night? Go right ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, and also under Obamacare, if you were to log on, trying to get your insurance, which you're required to have, if you were to log on and say, well, I think I want to look at the various plans, you can't do that until you give them a ton of information. You have to log in. And, man, they don't just want to know your the name and address. They want to know all kinds of information before you can even look at the plans that you might consider. So they're building these dossiers on all of us and getting tons and tons and tons of information to boot. And so, this is a massive collection of personal, private information that you don't give it to anybody else. You walk into a store and you want to get an object or use a credit card before I'm sorry, we're not going to let you look at those toys until you give us your religious affiliation and everything else about you personally.
Okay, hold that thought. We'll be back in a moment with Dr. Dennis Cuddy. Well, Dennis, you go right ahead.
Okay, well, picking up with what Toynbee said in June of 1931, his quote continues, the dragons, you always got to make it sound nasty and bad, the dragon of local sovereignty can still use its teeth and claws when it is brought to bay. Nevertheless, I believe that the monster is doomed to perish by our sword. He's going to slay national sovereignty. It continues, the 50 or 60 local states of the world will no doubt survive as administrative conveniences, but sooner or later, sovereignty will depart from them, end quote. So that's what their attitude was. That's 40 years after the founding by Cecil Rhodes of his secret society. So all of those Rhodes scholars who say, well, yes, Cecil Rhodes might have had some dream like that, but then he forgot about that and just said, we'll have some Rhodes scholars and everything will be hunky-dory.
Dennis, where can we get that quotation you just gave? That is such an important quotation.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me just continue, and my continuance will show you where you get it. In this chapter, The Bold New World, what I say next after quoting Toynbee was that he was one of those individuals pursuing Rhodes' as he said, quote, scheme to take the government of the whole world. Now, his paper that I just quoted from, that was reprinted in the November 1931 edition of International Affairs. That's the name of the journal. And that's the journal of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Remember, that's the counterpart, the British counterpart to the CFR. There's the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and in this country, the CFR. And the RIIA, Royal Institute of International Affairs, was an outgrowth specifically of the semi-secret round table groups that was formed. Those were formed primarily between 1908 and 1913 with the objective to further Rhodes' plan for this elite, as I call them, to dominate the world. And according to Bill Clinton's mentor, Carroll Quigley, at Georgetown University, in his book Tragedy and Hope, which was published in 1966, the elite who formed these roundtable groups, as Quigley says, quote, in 1919 founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He goes on, similar institutes of international affairs were established in the chief British dominions and in the United States, where it is known as the Council on Foreign Relations, end quote. So that's what Quigley said. So Quigley is saying this, and then you can get that specific journal article, the paper, which was reprinted in the November 1931 edition of International Affairs. Now, you can't get that at the local library, but if you go to any good college library, university library, they'll have that.
Okay, well, this is Dr. Stan. I guess it's Dr. Dennis Cuddy, and he's simply talking about the fact that Arnold Toynbee, writing in the 1930s in International Affairs, now International Affairs is the theoretical publication of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which is the English counterpart of the Council on Foreign Relations, and these two subversive organizations suddenly control, respectively, the British government and the American government, and almost all of the key positions in our government are held by people either members of the Council on Foreign Relations or related to it very, very closely. But this is how the government is run now, basically since 1973, by the Trilateral Commission has dominated our government. In fact, it's not by coincidence that between 1977 and the year 2009, every president of the United States or Vice President of the United States came from the membership roles of the Trilateral Commission, and when Barack Hussein Obama suddenly became president, he appointed 11 of the 87 or 85 members of the Trilateral Commission, North American chapter of the Trilateral Commission, to be his key advisors, and certainly many of those people are still in key positions today, and they control the Obama administration. He is simply a figurehead, but of course you're never going to read that in the controlled media because they control our reality. Dennis, you go right ahead.
Yeah, and remember about Brzezinski, just as a note to what I was saying earlier, remember in his book Between Two Ages, he praised Marxism. He said Marxism is wonderful. So just remember that as you look at his machinations under Jimmy Carter and under Obama and his grand chessboard scheme and what's happening in the Ukraine. Okay, now the Toynbee publication is November 1931 edition of International Affairs. That's the name of the journal. Now, he actually was delivering the speech, though. It was a speech, a paper he was presenting in Copenhagen. And the paper was actually read to what was called the Fourth Annual Conference of Institutions for the Scientific Study of International Relations. You know, it's a big, long title. And there were 12 countries were represented there when he gave the speech in Copenhagen, along with the delegates from 4 international organizations, and the conferences were initiated by the League of Nations. Its group, they had various groups. This was the League of Nations Institute for Intellectual Cooperation. That's what it was called. So that's what he was delivering his speech in his paper before that body in 1931. And coming out of that, of course, national coordinating committees were also formed, with one of their purposes being the execution of resolutions passed by the conferences. And in the Toynbee paper that I quoted from, he stated the following. Now, note specifically the word we, W-E, we, in this quote. Now, this is Toynbee in this same paper. Note where he uses the word we. He says, this is Toynbee, I will merely repeat that we are at present working discreetly, but with all our might, to wrest, that's W-R-E-S-T, wrest this mysterious political force called sovereignty out of the clutches of the local nation-states of the world. And all the time, we are denying with our lips what we are doing with our hands because to impugn the sovereignty of the local nation-states of the world is still a heresy for which a statesman or a publicist can be perhaps not quite burnt at the stake, but certainly can be ostracized and discredited, end quote.
But you see, the thing is that the average individual has no idea that the people who control both of our political parties are subversives. They do not believe in the United States. They're using the financial and military power of the United States to bring about a world government. That is why we have over 1,000 foreign military bases. Suddenly we have our troops stationed in at least 130 nations. I mean, why do we have massive numbers, 40, 50,000 troops permanently stationed in Germany and 30 or 40,000 troops permanently stationed in Japan and 20 or 30,000 troops permanently stationed in South Korea? Troops stationed all over the world, because we control the world, ladies and gentlemen. We control those governments. The people there think they elect their representatives. They don't, any more than we elect our representatives. We go to the polls every 4 years to vote for the candidate of their choice, not our choice. Why suddenly in 2008 did we have John McCain, the most liberal Republican senator in the U.S. Senate, running against Barack Obama, the most liberal Democrat senator in the United States Senate, because both of them are controlled by the same people. Go right ahead, Dr. Cuddy.
Okay, now, somebody might say, okay, so there's this guy, Toynbee, and he makes a speech in 1931, and okay, but that's isolated. You can't really say there's this massive movement just because of that. Well, remember, Cecil Rhodes had this plan. It would be a conspiracy for 6 decades. He figured by the end of that time, he would have about 3,000, at least, of his people spread around the world, and then they could select others. But just to give an example how this Toynbee quote from 1931 isn't the only thing, there was a book at that time, same year, 1931, and it was titled International Understanding, Agencies Educating for a New World. And the book was by John Eugene Harley. Well, there's a fellow who wrote the foreword to that book called Paul Mantoux, M-A-N-T-O-U-X. He wrote the foreword to that book. And in that foreword, he says, quote, how can a well-prepared elite, they use that word, elite, be raised throughout the world to spread its influence over the masses who can then support them in their turn, question mark? Then he answers himself. Plainly, the first step is the step in the case of each country is to train an elite to think, feel, and act internationally, period, end quote. So remember, world citizen, Barack Obama, that type of life. Yeah, world citizen. See, you got to train to think, feel, and act internationally, end quote. Now, in order to do that in the U.S., though, our Constitution, which is a nationalist document, would first have to be undermined, right? You got to undermine it. You got to get rid of that concept of that old traditional Constitution. And in that regard, if you look the next year, 1932, there was a fellow named William K. Wallace, and he wrote a book that was titled Our Obsolete Constitution. See, how convenient. The very next year, this book, Our Obsolete Constitution, is published. And Wallace had, he's not, you've probably never heard of him, but anyway, Wallace had accompanied President Wilson to Paris after World War I and was attached to the American Commission to negotiate the peace. So this is no, just ivory tower guy who's just got an idea. He's right up there with President Wilson. And in that book that Wallace wrote, Our Obsolete Constitution, now remember, this is a guy traveling with Woodrow Wilson. He wrote in his book, Wallace did, the age of individualism is past. The Constitution is no longer adequate to meet the requirements of our age. This is 1932, he's writing this. The individual must adopt the one best way or plan which has been scientifically determined by experts. The absurdity of such doctrines as those of national rights and a social contract has long been recognized. As we have gone beyond the stage of believing in an avenging God, see, we've gone beyond that. See, God, that type of God, he's old-fashioned. As we have gone beyond the stage of believing in an avenging God, so we are coming to realize that ideas of political sovereignty are borrowing from ignorant notions about the source of power in the state. Sovereignty in its narrow territorial aspects must be abandoned. We must be prepared to integrate scientific capitalism with the principle of scientific socialism. It is admitted on all sides that national directive control of industry must be undertaken. In the immediate future, the state will control the means of production, end quote. So here you have this nice guy, a guy traveling around with President Wilson, and we're going to have a joining of capitalism and socialism, and sovereignty, national sovereignty is old-fashioned, just like the avenging God, he's old-fashioned, and so we have to move forward to this wonderful scientific... Now remember, this is 1932. FDR is going to basically run on this type of platform, and he will develop, when he gets in the office of president, he'll develop national planning boards and so forth and so on.
And of course, basically what we're really saying, this is why the United States, at least the elite who run the United States, funded National Socialism in Germany.
Yep.
This is why they funded communism in Russia. It's all in this together. We're going to certainly have these enemies over there as we centralize more and more power in Washington, D.C., and the people go along with it because they think we have enemies overseas, and they give up step by step their individual freedom as we move towards an authoritarian structure under a ruling elite in the United States, and that's just exactly what we have today. And you go to the polls every 4 years, you vote for the candidate of their choice, and they put in electronic voting machines across America so they can rig the elections. Have you checked to see how your votes are actually counted? Have you checked to see if they've actually counted fairly? Do you honestly believe that there is one electronic voting machine out there that can't be rigged if they want to? Go right ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, and in the same year, 1932, a Rhodes Scholar, there's always a Rhodes Scholar, lurking around somewhere, Rhodes Scholar Clyde Eagleton's book, which is called International Government, that was published. And in the preface of I guess it's like the second edition, 1948 edition, the revised, he stated, quote, "I am concerned with the slowly evolving constitutional law and organization of the community of nations developing toward international or world government," end quote. And then in the text of the book, he noted that, quote, "The following arguments have been offered in favor of regionalism. Number one, development should be attempted gradually rather than in one jump toward world government. Such a world system could be better built upon the solid foundation of regional systems." Doesn't that sound familiar? That's what Brzezinski would say at the 1995 First Gorbachev State of the World Forum.